Well, it's a dangerous and volatile international strategic climate at the moment. 2025 looms with many problems, but there's also a bit of hope from a lot of people, including me, that the return of Donald Trump to the White House might put Iran, Russia and China on the back foot. Have a listen to what Donald Trump was saying again just last week when it comes to the Middle East.
If those hostages aren't back, I don't want to hurt your negotiation. If they're not back by the time I get into office, all hell will break out in the Middle East.
Can you elaborate?
And it will not be good for Hamas, and it will not be good, frankly, for anyone. All hell will break out.
Yeah, well, don't we all want to see those hostages, and especially those, of course, those who are alive, released? But there's only a week to go before he's sworn in. We'll see what happens. Now, Peter Jennings from Strategic Analysis Australia has written for The Australian, made 10 predictions about the year ahead. There's some pretty gloomy reading there. He joins me now live from Canberra. Thanks for joining us again, Peter. Great to talk to you. Happy New Year to you. Well, actually, you've laid out a year that looks pretty daunting for us. Let's start with your first prediction, and that is the likelihood of a terrorist attack here in Australia.
So I think you could call that almost a certainty, Chris. The head of ASIO, Mike Burgess, says a better than 50% chance. And you could call the attacks on synagogues terrorism attacks. But
Indeed.
What I'm really talking about is the risk of people losing their lives. And I think over the last 14, 15 months, we've seen the build-up of a pool of extremist sentiment, which is going to finally seek an outlet through terrorism action. So I think that's a very high chance that we're going to see a really serious case of terrorism at some point in the next 12 months.
It plays into the debate I've been having in the first part of the show, where there's been so much weakness from the federal government on Islamist extremism and on anti-Semitism. And I'm not saying that that would necessarily prevent a terrorist attack, but it doesn't help, surely.
It really doesn't, and even with the graffitiing of a synagogue just over the end of last week, you know, the absence of federal political leaders, the Prime Minister being a spectator rather than a leader of attempts to push back against this type of behaviour, all of this, I think, is creating an environment where terrorism becomes more likely. And, you know, we've seen a number of instances around the world. There's always a risk of copycat violence. And if people think they can get away with it because government's not that focused on it and the police aren't sure about how to deal with it, then that creates a greater risk. So, you know, to me, I don't know if it's so much a prediction, almost as a certainty that we're going to see terrorist action, which Australia will have to deal with. And we need stronger responses from our federal government in order to try and push that back and stop it from taking place.
Let's go to some of the other global threats. You talk about China acting this year to blockade Taiwan. That would create all sorts of instability and possibilities.
So we've seen 2 blockades in the last 18 months or so where Chinese military forces have completely surrounded the island, and the Chinese say what they're doing is building a new normal where this is going to happen more frequently. There's daily incursions into Taiwanese airspace. I think China is going to push the limits of this because they want to test President Trump's reaction. They want to see how and in what ways the new president is going to push back against this activity. And if there is no pushback, China will keep going. So, again, I'm not predicting an amphibious assault or anything like that, although China doesn't rule out military action. But there's certainly going to be, I think, more attempts to show Chinese military force around Taiwan. And this is all really just to see how will the Americans react, and the Chinese will try and get away with doing more.
You also talk about Israel taking out Iranian nuclear facilities. That's always been the belief that if the rest of the world stands by and watches Iran develop nuclear weapons, Israel won't. They'll have to take them out. Broadly, when you talk about that situation and also Ukraine and also Australia's relationship with the US through AUKUS, what difference is Donald Trump going to make?
So I think this time with Trump, we are going to see an American president that wants to, you know, negotiate from positions of strength, that is not going to be pushed around by authoritarian leaders, even though he's expressed some sympathies towards Putin in the past. Trump doesn't want to go to war, but he doesn't want to be bullied by authoritarian regimes either. And I think this potentially means we're going to see a stronger, more muscular American response. Under Biden, what we've seen in the last 12 months, every time there was a military conflict, all Biden could ever ask for was for de-escalation, often in ways which didn't suit America's allies, like Israel, for example. So I think that will change. And I would hope that, a stronger, more tough-minded America is going to put more pressure on the bad regimes, but it's also going to put more pressure on a country like Australia to step forward and do more in defence. We've been riding on American security coattails for decades, Chris, spending way too little on defence. And I think Trump will realise that that's a type of behaviour that needs to be called out. That may explain why Prime Minister Albanese doesn't seem that interested in meeting Donald Trump at the moment. I think he's worried that the president is going to be saying to him, you Australians need to do more. And it can't just be about promises of what AUKUS might deliver in 10 or 15 years. Yeah,
what are we doing now? What are we doing in the coming years? Fascinating stuff, lots of challenges, but some hope there with the incoming administration. Thanks so much for joining us, Peter. I appreciate it. Peter Jennings there from Strategic Analysis Australia.